Our Fantasy Football Today waiver wire is presented by Snickers. Rookie mistake? Maybe you just need a Snickers. Or maybe you just need somebody on that waiver wire to help you this week. A couple of tight ends available, including Will Dissly, who is only owned in about a fourth of leagues. For more on the guys available that you should be looking at, we send it to Dave Richard and Jamie Eisenberg.
All right, Chris, thank you. Let's get to the waiver wire ads that we're looking at here. And the tight ends are in really a good spot given the fact that some of the guys that we have on a bye. Remember, 6 teams on a bye, so you're down guys like Taysom Hill's coming off a 40-point game last week. You're down Kyle Pitts. You're down Evan Ingram. And even guys like Mike Gesicki and the Bills guys who have been in a lot of lineups recently. So tight end makes some sense, Dave, when we talk about some of these players that could be productive for this week. Will Dissly and Jonnu Smith both coming off huge games. You see the way this Chargers offense is performing. Dissly's in a great spot. And Jonnu Smith, one of the best games for any Dolphins pass catcher this season. We'll talk about that in a second. Cole Kmet saw a spike in playing time in the first game with Thomas Brown as the offensive coordinator, 97%. Jatavion Sanders and Theo Johnson were playing well going into their bye weeks. Some things have changed. Adam Thielen back for the Panthers. That can impact Sanders. New quarterback for the Giants with Tommy DeVito. And then Lou Schoonmaker could be a good one-week replacement with Jake Ferguson suffering a concussion. We saw 10 targets for Schoonmaker, although we did see over 50 pass attempts for Cooper Rush in that loss against the Texans. For Dissly, here's what he did against the Bengals. 4 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. He's got at least 6 targets in 4 of his last 5 games. He's gotten 8 or more PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games, but 2 of those games over 16 PPR points. I love the setup for him this week. I think he's going to be a must-start tight end taking on the Ravens.
Yeah, it's going to be a shootout game, lots of passing, and obviously the key to Dissly is the targets and the quarterback, because he himself is not doing amazing things on the field other than just running his route, not getting covered tightly, and Justin Herbert's finding him consistently. He's got a 23% target per route run rate in 5 of his last 6 games. I had to look at it just to double check it. And really, it's just been since the bye week for the Chargers, Dissly's been more involved. And you think about the offensive coordinator for the Chargers, it's Greg Roman. He used to be in Baltimore. Tight ends were huge there. Now they're being used here. Dissly is one of my favorite guys to get at any position off the waiver wire.
Jonnu Smith not far behind him based on what he just did against the Raiders, where he had 6 catches for 101 yards and 2 touchdowns on 8 targets. Very similar to Dissly, what he's done lately. 7.5 PPR points in 4 of his last 4 games. 2 spike games in those last 5 outings. And with the way that Tua Tagovailoa is throwing the ball, getting the ball to his hands quickly, we've seen him ascend to basically being the number 2 pass catcher in Miami, which has been at the detriment of Jalen Waddle, unfortunately. So it's been kind of Jonnu and Devon Achane as that go-to option for Tua Tagovailoa, and we'll see if that continues moving forward. But he does have an interesting matchup in Week 12, taking on the Patriots, his former team. You see what he did here historically, just a fantastic performance for Jonnu Smith, but he did spend some time with New England, so we'll see if that matters to him taking on his former team. They've been sort of hit or miss against tight ends lately. Is Jonnu Smith also a must-start tight end for you this week?
He is a must-start tight end, more so in full PPR than non-PPR, but he's going to make the top 12. I mean, there's so many teams on bye, it only makes sense. And he's seen a target per route run rate of at least 21% in each of his past 5 games. So different quarterbacks, different situations, different players on and off the field, and different types of defenses that he's playing against. And he's still consistently getting work. Lots of those short throws, and including one big one last week when he had a coverage breakdown against the Raiders.
Let's go from one pass catching group to the other as we look at wide receivers. And again, a lot of stars missing with the 6 teams on a bye here. So you're going to see a lot of these lists are going to be somewhat top heavy in terms of the guys that we like, but there are other options here. So we'll talk about Christian Watson and Elijah Moore, but you got Demario Douglas, who's been kind of living that 9.5 to 10 PPR range. He's 7 targets per game in his last 3. Jalen McMillan, I'm curious to see if now with Mike Evans back, does he sort of get a little bit of a boost? And remember, before the hamstring injury and then basically not playing in his last game before the bye, he had 7+ targets in his 2 previous games. Adam Thielen's back. Xavier Legette's got 3 touchdowns in his last 5 games. Marcos Valdes-Scantling worth rostering during their bye week just based on the big play potential that he's shown. Nick Westbrook-Akina's got 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games. Alec Pierce, 74 yards receiving against the Jets. Trying to find a second receiver for the Broncos because Bo Nix has been awesome. So Devon Vele's got 10+ PPR points in his last 2 games. And then the last 2 guys on this list, Ray McLeod and Parker Washington, both on a bye. But Darnell Mooney's got a hamstring injury, and Gabe Davis may not return this season. So both guys could be needed coming off the bye for their respective teams. But let's talk about Christian Watson because he was awesome in the Week 11 win for the Packers over the Bears. 4 targets, 4 catches, 150 yards. And what's more impressive about that, Dave, is 4 targets on 17 pass attempts for Jordan Love. So if the pass attempts go up, hopefully the targets rise for Watson as well. Prior to their bye, he did have 6 targets in each of his 2 previous games as they're trying to get him going. And if he starts to get going, He could be an absolute nuclear missile. He's that good. And we've seen some of the spike games for him over the course of his young career. So I hope to see the best of Christian Watson yet to come, and even starting in this matchup for week number 12 against the 49ers.
There's no question that he's the receiver with the most upside that you can pick up off the waiver wire. He's got the best quarterback, I would say, of anybody that you can pick up off the waiver wire that's worth potentially starting. And when you think about all the buys at wide receiver, not just this week, but in week 14, another 6 teams are going to be on bye. Well, here's somebody who's got upside to be a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. He just has the downside to be what he was. Remember what he was in his prior 2 games before this last one? He was under 8 PPR points in each of those games.
But that's really not fair, though, because Love had
more targets in those games.
But Love had the groin injury in the first of those 3 games you're referencing against Jacksonville when he had 8 targets. And then the 7-target game was in the rain against Detroit when Love was clearly not 100%.
That's fine, too. But it's done to illustrate what he's capable of doing just in terms of upside and downside. And he's not catching touchdowns at the same rate that he did in years past. I don't mean to poo-poo him. I love the upside of Christian Watson. I just think Elijah Moore's a little bit safer. He's had at least 8 targets in each of his last 3 games. He's got that short area target role on lock with Jameis Winston. This is a Browns offense that's going to throw a lot. And he's had over 16 PPR points in 2 of his last 3 games. So he's not anywhere near as exciting as Christian Watson. But you can set your watch to 10 PPR points. I think he's done that in 4 straight games. But he does have decent upside. I would say Watson does have sky-high upside. It depends on the format of your league and what you're looking for. If you want somebody that you're going to be able to start week in and week out, not really sweat it too much, I would say Elijah Moore's the better guy. If you want somebody who you might be starting week in and week out and just has sky-high upside, we've talked about it enough already, Christian Watson's the guy to go.
The only thing to keep in mind with Elijah Moore, and this is what we've seen in the 3 games with Jameis Winston, 2 great matchups. Moore's numbers were great in those 2 games. Jameis Winston's numbers were great in those 2 games. The one tough matchup was against the Chargers. Winston struggled. Moore struggled. What do they have coming up? 2 games
it's a tough schedule.
Pittsburgh,
yes.
A game against Denver, a game against Kansas City. So with the schedule getting tougher, can you buy into Elijah Moore still doing it? That's the question I think we have to find out. And this is going to be a telling game on Thursday night, taking on the Steelers defense that has just been fantastic against almost everything. So I do think Elijah Moore definitely worth adding. Certainly could be somebody that's getting, look, all these Browns receivers, Jerry Jeudy, if he's still available in your waiver wire, he should be the #1 receiver to add. He's just been fantastic in the 3 games with Winston. But I just think you're looking at it. Somebody's going to get left out. That was the case for Moore 2 games ago against the Chargers. Cedric Tillman was the one left out last week in the loss, against the Saints. So it's not going to be all these guys producing at a high level, but I do think that you're looking at Elijah Moore as a safe #3 wide receiver in PPR. Hopefully can do some things in the other formats as well. Let's transition to the running backs now as we're looking at a very ugly list. And we actually like it when it's an ugly list because that means that there's not a lot of injuries. But also, as we know, again, 6 teams on a bye, so you're missing some star running backs for this week. So here's what we have with this group. If you're looking for somebody for 1 week only, it might be Amir Abdullah as the one to go get first. Why? Because both Alexander Mattison and Zamir White are dealing with injuries. They couldn't finish the game against Miami in week 11. So that puts Abdullah potentially as a starter. Dylan Lobby could also get some opportunities as well. He only has 1 carry in the season. He fumbled in that 1 carry. So not a good rookie season so far for him. He's been inactive for the last 4 games. But Abdullah can work in the passing game, had 3 catches against the Dolphins, 16 yards receiving, and scored a touchdown. Edwards, Akers, Ford, maybe not so much Jalen Wright, but Edwards, Akers, and Ford have been getting work the last 2 weeks. 6 carries for Edwards last week, 12-plus touches for Akers the last 2 games. Ford, 4 catches last week in the loss against the Saints. And then let's go back to the guys at the top. We'll start with Roschon Johnson. We'll touch on Trey Benson for a second. But Roschon Johnson, Dave, first game with Thomas Brown. What did we see? 10 carries, 33 yards, and a touchdown, only 1 catch for 8 yards. But he played a season high in snap percentage. And what happened with DeAndre Swift? Second lowest snap percentage for him this season. So are we going to see maybe a 1A and 1B situation where Johnson getting more work? Is that something you'd buy into?
I buy into the Bears chasing points in a lot of their games, and that's when we'll see a little bit more of Roschon Johnson. I think the Bears are a little bit more comfortable putting him on the field as a pass protector. Certainly, we've seen him play a lot as a 3rd down back already this season, and he's used at the goal line. Just 4 games this year with north of 8 PPR points. That's kind of problematic. He doesn't have neither a high ceiling nor a high floor, but he does play from week to week, and if last week is an indicator that the Bears are going to use 2 backs instead of 1 most of the time, then it does make sense. At least you can get something out of Roschon Johnson.
And the the case of Johnson and Trey Benson, they're lottery tickets. Something happens to DeAndre Swift, Roschon Johnson will be a must-start running back. Trey Benson's gotten work each of his last 2 games, 10-plus PPR points each of his last 2 games. Something happens to James Conner, who, by the way, has missed 3-plus games in 5 of the last 6 seasons. Trey Benson would be a must-start running back, so don't overlook him, even though he's coming off a bye.
Got to get him if you've got James Conner.
Quarterbacks to target for this week, and again, you're down some pretty important players at this position with the 6 teams that are off this week. So you got Anthony Richardson coming off an amazing game last week against the Jets. Drake Mays coming off a good stretch of games, and Jameis Winston coming off a strong game. Derek Carr's on this list just if you're looking ahead. Very good schedule for the Saints, and he's got 22 fantasy points each of his last 2 games. And then you get some 2 QB options. We'll put Will Levis also. You can check him out in the column. He's on this list as well. Bryce Young, Tommy DeVito, and Gardner Minshew. DeVito is going to start for the Giants. Minshew's still going to be the starter for the Raiders, and the same thing with Bryce Young for the Panthers. But in the case of Anthony Richardson, what a game he had against the Jets. 2 rushing touchdowns, 20 of 30 completions for a guy that was completing 44% of his passes. That was impressive to see, and you see where he stacks up here in terms of NFL history by youth and performance and success. Just a studly game for him. Dave, is this sustainable, or was this the Jets?
I think it's a little bit about the Jets, and as far as the rushing goes, at least the rushing opportunities, he had a bunch of designed runs in the game. I think that's sustainable. The passing, honestly, I thought it was the best he's thrown the football yet in his young career, and he really hasn't played that much in the NFL, but I thought he actually did a good job. He was calm in the pocket. He wasn't trying to get rid of the ball quickly. He had good footwork.
It's easy when you're calm when nobody's pressuring you.
No, there were times where they were pressuring him, and he still made good plays. So he deserves a lot of credit for it, but you're right. The Jets are an easier matchup for quarterbacks. Let's see what he does in tougher matchups, including this week against Detroit. He's not a top 12 fantasy quarterback yet. He's a bye-week replacement quarterback. So if you want to go to your waiver wire and pick him up to replace somebody like Josh Allen this week who's not playing, it makes sense. You can also pick him up off the waiver wire and potentially trade him. If not now, assuming your trade deadline does extend an extra week, you could trade him after this week if he has a good game, and now you're getting something good for a player that you're just picking up off of the waiver wire. You might not ever start him, but your opponent might. He's got huge upside, Jamie, and it's because of the rushing. It's what we talked about. It's what you talked about all preseason long, and now we're starting to see him take a step forward. If he does it again against Detroit, I think a lot of people will buy in.
I don't mind Drake May as a good 1-week replacement. Also might be in a better spot than Richardson because of his matchup against Miami. But also, look, those 2 guys go head-to-head against each other in Week 13. No team's on a bye in Week 13, but Week 14, unfortunately, Richardson will not be there, so you might be searching for another quarterback again in a couple of weeks. All right, make sure you check out our Fantasy Football Today podcast. You can find us wherever podcasts are available. Scan the QR code if you just want to make it easy on yourself. But check out the YouTube page as well, our Fantasy Football Today podcast on YouTube. You can see what we look like there if you just haven't got enough of watching us here. But we have a lot of fun on that show as well, the Fantasy Football Today podcast, wherever podcasts are found.